Good morning, fellas. We
Good
are.
morning.
Hope each of you had a great Thanksgiving. Some of us have been online talking about our Thanksgiving holiday. It's a great holiday, and hope you all enjoyed that time with your family. We're continuing our study in John, of course, and here we are in John 8. So let's just dive into it. It's verses 34 through 38, and we'll pick up where we left off last week. Last time I created this slide. It says, when it comes to a type of relationship that I would define it as a greater and a lesser. That's a type of a relationship. Myself and maybe a superior would be one example of that. I think we have a tendency as humans to frame that relationship in master and slave. I think that's a natural tendency, and as a result of our condition as human beings, we tend to profile relationships. This is because we humans naturally think in terms of comparison. Now, we haven't talked about this for a long time, but comparison, right? This word is actually represented on the slide. We looked at this way back when we were looking. Comparison would be illustrated right here. There's three types. These arrows represent three ways we as humans look at relationships. And I think all three are due to our what I call the human condition, you could call the fall of man. I prefer to use the human condition for reasons I won't go into, but comparison is where we look at a relationship like this, and that would be a master-slave. The upper would be the, and depending on how I view myself, I will play that role within that relationship. That is one of the major primary driver in our relationship with God. Then the other two are we dominate is the little arrow with the curved line. We dominate. They all begin with C, and I can't remember. Comparison, and then we dominate like this. And then the other is where we run up against the wall. We're just contrary. That's the word, is just that if someone says it's this, it's this. And these are human tendencies that cause all kinds of issues in our relationships. But I think this is me, I just think we tend to profile relationships. However, and in relation to God, the type of relationship Jesus is talking about in the text and inviting his followers, it's always about invitation with Jesus, is more like a father and a son. This is what we talked about last week, father and son. Morning, Jeff. We also tend to find difficulty in receiving what Jesus is inviting all to receive. Guys, I keep coming back to this idea that I think the biggest difficulty we have being human, it's part of being human, is this inability to receive. And the reason is we just don't feel we measure up. What you could use a lot of different terms there, is that we want to keep, there's something we have to do to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. And that's an innate part of being human. As we ponder these two types of relationships, that being slave and son, it's not about excluding one or the other. There's another thing that I tend to do. I don't know about you guys, but I tend to just show me which one I need to do. Am I supposed to be like this or like this? Well, it's not that easy. There is aspects of the slave that are true, and there is aspects, slave rightly defined, and then as the son. But Jesus is inviting these folks into a son type of relationship. And I've got in here, it's not that we exclude the slave over the other, but rather include it. And most importantly, the most important thing is to live out. Transformation is about learning to live out what is already true about us. And I would, for one, for me personally, it's taken years and years and years to finally start to understand a little bit of what this means. So let's take a look at that. I want to hit this slide again before we move on. Slave and son examined. We looked at this last week. Bob, you weren't with us, and I don't think Jeff was with us, but in the text, Jesus, the crowd brings up this idea: we are slaves to no one. We are sons of Abraham. And of course, the rub in the text is Jesus is going to show them or gently persuade them to the disconnect in their thinking. If you think this, then what you're thinking about me is not correct. So how slaves think, how sons think. So this relationship, a slave style relationship to a lesser and greater when it comes to God, is based on a purchase. And that purchase is by the master providing life for the slave. We are familiar with that in our evangelical background, the one buying the freedom of the many. There's a very good aspect to that, and some other issues that we have a hard time getting through. The contrast to that is the son relationship is based on an act of love, all the way from conception. This talk about a normal family loving unit, and that son or daughter, we're talking about sons here, but the same is true with daughters, is based on love, an act of love, and all the way through supported by love. And that's what this relationship is based on. It's based on love, not on a purchase. This relationship is characterized on the left side through a transaction. There's a big word there. It's all transactionary, where the master purchased the slave, and the slave serves the master. And it's here and here, back and forth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This relationship is characterized, in contrast, primarily through transformation. Transformation here. And this, guys, I would also say that I believe transformation is the primary subject of the Gospels, is transformation. And that's the journey that we are all on, being transformed into the image of Christ. Primarily, and transformation is about literally embracing what is already true about me. And there's where we have difficulty as people. Not just certain kinds of people, all people. Satisfaction occurs as I fulfill my obligations, and I understand it. As I understand it, I do, whatever denomination I'm in, I do the deal, and I feel good about myself. Fairness is a big deal because it's tit for tat. It's I do my part, God does his part. And this is why you have a lot of disconnect with, say, God, how could you? Because we think like slaves. And that is one outcome of that. On the other hand, in contrast, satisfaction occurs by I allow myself to be loved. That is so hard. Now we think, of course I know I'm loved by God, but guys, the rub comes in is when I sin, how do I view God and myself in light of that? That tells everything about what I really think. I know theologically we all believe we're loved by God, but me, you, and the rest of humanity that we deal with or that we work with, this whole thing of allowing myself to be loved by embracing what's already true about me. And then hope for the future is based on of my ability to keep doing. It's about doing and pleasing the master, doing my part, being, in our framework, a good Christian, versus a not so good Christian. Hope, on the other side, is based on receiving what is already true about me, all of the truth that is already has been established through God and through Christ, my genetics, being in the image of God, so forth. So anyway, that's what we talked about, and that subject has come up. Jesus didn't bring the subject up, the people did. He's just responding and going along with this, creating an illustration. So verse 37, Jesus says, guys, I know that you are Abraham's descendants. They've already said this at least once, possibly twice. I get the verses mixed up, but it's going to be more than once. They bring that, this is a big deal. They have a heritage. They have what we would call a ticket. They are of the right genetics. And that's sonship. However, he says, yet you are seeking to kill me. And then he gives a reason, because my word has no place in you. So he's saying, he affirms the crowds operate at what I call operative basis, Abraham's descendants. They are that. That's true. He doesn't argue that. And then Jesus guides them to the disconnect and how they are thinking. And here's the disconnect. If this is true, he's saying, we are Abraham's descendants. If this is true, which he doesn't argue, then this should not be true. You are seeking to kill me. Those two do not go together. And that's what he's going to be talking about. And the reason underlying this disparity is my word has no place in you. Now, where our heads go is we go, okay, we need to be obedient and carry out all the words of Jesus. Well, I differ. I beg to differ. As we have examined, his word, Jesus's word, has everything to do with the letting go of self-created and group-supported fantasy constructs. I think these people are living out of their heads. They create these worlds, and these worlds come back to bite them. And I am no different. The crowd continues to resist because letting go requires, this is his word. His word is about letting go and through trust. The crowd continues to resist because letting go requires too much. It's just too scary. I have my world. I built it all up. I can't let that go. And then I put something here. Maybe think of it as just too much head clutter. There's just too much in my head. I don't even know it, but I've got too many constructs and connections, and the way that I view how things are, what is right and what is wrong and what is abhorrent and what is good, and my history, and there's just too much clutter that I have created to remove it. And that is, it's certainly true in my head. And what Jesus is calling us to, in my opinion, is a letting go of that through trust, a letting go. And then, as he says, if the Son sets you free, you will really be free. So he goes to verse 38, and he says, I speak of the things, after he lays this disconnect out, I speak of the things which I have seen with my Father. Therefore, you also do the things which you heard from your father. Well, there's a variant. We'll talk about it in just a minute. Jesus punctuates what he just said about affirming Abraham's descendants, but yet pointing out their disparity in their thinking. He just said, by bringing the crowd to what it should look like if one is operating from what truly is. And in our way, we're defining it as in the study is I think I'm using the term the mind of Christ. It's a biblical term out of Philippians, and I think you and I are being called an invitation to operate out of the mind of Christ. We'll be talking over and over about this. What is the mind of Christ? Well, if you read Philippians 2, it gives a pretty good definition. It has everything about letting go. And that is the mind of Christ. He that was in the form of God did not equate equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he let it go. That in essence is the mind of Christ. Jesus's words and actions are aligned because they are, and I would say always, sourced from what truly is his Father. Jesus and the Father are one. And it's the true reality, the one reality, and it's what is. However, the crowd's actions demonstrate who they are actually following. And Jesus calls it your Father. Now, we'll get further into that, but he's just saying your Father. Note the variant reading in some translations of this verse. I am telling you, here's the New English translation. I am telling you the things I have seen while with my Father. That's the same, the A phrase. And then semicolon, as for you, and then he turns, the NET translates the text into a command. As for you, practice the things you have heard from the Father. Now, most of the translations are as it's read in the black. Some turn it into a command. I don't think it makes any difference. I think what the NET translators are trying to do to help us is not really very helpful at all. I don't think it's a command. If it is a command, it doesn't hurt the reading of the text at all. Because in a sense, yes, practice the things you've heard from the Father. Yeah, I don't argue that. I don't think anybody would argue that, but it turns it into something we adhere to in our untransformed way of thinking that we kind of get into at times is more do's. You know, I do this, and Jesus kind of scolding and says, you need to do it too. Now, that doesn't have to be the way we read it. It's how I naturally would read it, but we don't have to read it that way. What he's saying is absolutely true. If we take that translation, I prefer the other translation, and basically making a statement that I am responding, Jesus says, to my source, the Father, and you are responding and acting out of your source, your Father.
Tradition.
And what's that?
Tradition.
Yeah. Well, you got a laugh out of that, but I couldn't hear it. I'm sorry. My hearing aids.
I'm saying
He said tradition, Mike.
they're acting out of the things they hear from their Father. That's tradition.
Oh yeah, tradition. Yeah, okay. That is out of Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes.
Now I understand. Thank you. Again, in the point in this whole thing, whether one adheres to one translation or the other, is what one does demonstrates our true operating source. It's not what we say, it's what we do. And this should be self-evident to all present and to us, to the readers of the first century church readers, and to us, is what we do speaks volumes over what we say. And that's a given. The relationship between our Their words and actions are grossly misaligned. This is caused by their, and here's my interpretation, that by their fantasy constructs. Remember, we got to go back. These people have believed. It says, verse 31, I think. But they're living out of their heads. Fantasy construct, which Jesus describes through attaching the term "your father." He's calling that your father. They're responding to that. Jesus has yet to name their father. And I'm using the word source because it helps me. I think it's a good word. Their source, what motivates them. He has yet to name that. But at this point, it's clear that they claim that what they claim is important doesn't align with their actions. That's where we are at this point. So this review, this section is talking about the alignment of words and actions. That's what this is about. And actions are a means to verify a true motivation, our source. If we want to know where we're really coming from, we look at our actions. What is true with this crowd is that which they claim to be, Abraham's descendants. They've got great heritage. That's wonderful. And Jesus doesn't contest that. However, their claim does not line up with their intent towards Jesus, and that is they are intent to kill him, to get rid of him. He's a bother. Jesus points out the discrepancies as a way to draw the crowd into relationship. That's another thing I have noticed in John over and over again. Jesus is speaking about invitation and drawing people in. I don't think he's there shaking his finger and pointing and scolding them, although they are incorrect, but it is with the intent of drawing them in. However, hearing such words is difficult for many. You know, if it's an invitation, why don't they respond? Because it's hard. The reasons are numerous, but the common barrier is, here we are again, refusal to let go. I got my way. Facing such discrepancies always requires a dying, and there simply is no other way. So our table time, we can spend some time with it. We got a lot of time to talk about this. I drew up a matrix, and this summarizes verses 34 through 38. The crowd brings up, we are slave to no one. And Jesus quite succinctly responds, if you are Abraham's descendants, then why are you trying to kill me? Good point. So crowd claim Abraham's descendants, and the fallacy is they're planning to kill Jesus. These are people who have responded positively to Jesus in the past. The term believer is used in the text. Now that really speaks to me, and I'll talk about it here in a minute. My claim as a follower of Jesus, then why have I had destructive thoughts towards others for various reasons? Destructive thoughts. Sandra and I got into this discussion the other night, and I've identified several people that both she and I know where I've had destructive thoughts. Of course, I want to sugarcoat it and say, well, it wasn't quite murder, but we also have to look at what Jesus said. It's the idea of wishing ill towards others, and what that has led me to is just a deep dive into why did I think that? And of course, the question is now, who do I have destructive thoughts toward? This matrix leads us to two questions. And again, claiming to be a follower of Jesus and destructive thoughts, as we see in the text. The first question is, what destructive thoughts do I need to let go of? And then secondly, here is another really interesting question, I think. Is there any justification for any kind of destructive thought pattern? Well, pattern maybe that's not a good word. It's kind of we kind of view that as a habit. But we could leave that off. Is there any justification for any kind of destructive thought? So I'll open that up to you guys. Hopefully we can talk personally, but also on a larger basis of what do you guys think about the idea of being a follower of Jesus, but yet holding ill will towards other people?
That would be a definition for a hypocrite.
For a hypocrite?
Yeah.
It kind of, I agree with that. It kind of just comes on you. None of us want to be, no, I'm no hypocrite. I don't want to be, I don't want to be deemed a hypocrite, but I have held ill will towards other people.
Righteous ill will.
What's that?
Righteous ill will.
Yeah, well, in my mind,
Yeah.
that's the game.
Yeah.
For no reason. And at this age, you start thinking about, well, why did I think that? Because I felt they were trying to take something away from me. Or by their mere existence, they were, I wouldn't receive what is entitled to me. A lot of what Sandra and I talked about was when we were younger, because we went to high school together and personalities in the high school. But things like comparison, jealousies, being rejected, that was a big one. Being rejected by someone, and then you move into a hate mode. That's huge.
I think,
Mike,
I think a lot of it is people's actions too. I mean, to say that you think, that I think inappropriately about people many times is I'm thinking about their actions. I don't like what they're doing, and I don't like that what they're doing, how it affects me. So I think poorly of them, but it's not really them that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking of their actions. And I think of like the scribes and the Pharisees are loved by God just as much as he loves Jesus. He's without, discrimination. But Jesus yells at them and says, you whited sepulchres, you scorpions, and says all kinds of crazy stuff about him. If you listen to him, you would think he doesn't like these people at all. So he didn't like what they were doing, but them as a person, a incarnation of God, or a human being. I don't know if he thought that way about them, but he didn't like what they were doing. And so he called them on it. And I think many times for me, I did that, like with working at motor vehicles. I was put in front of hundreds of people a day, more so than a normal life would be. And much of the citizens were angry when they got to my desk and let me know about it. And 15 years of somebody yelling at you, your opinion of people mind went down to like, I didn't like people at all. But really what I didn't like was their actions. You know, the person sitting there was, the result of God's grace. I just didn't like him yelling at me.
So does
You know,
that help you? Let me ask you a question. Does that help you correlate what we're seeing in front of us with these? And I'd like to talk about that. Why are these people want to kill Jesus? Does that help you, Vince, correlate or reconcile would be a better word? Their ill will towards Jesus versus how Jesus speaks out against others through name calling at other times. How can you correlate? I mean, how do you reconcile? Does that, what you just said, was that your attempt to reconcile that?
well, I think for me, it's what I had to do was I had to separate people because I found myself after 15 years working for the county. I'm a Christian. I'm supposed to love people. I'm supposed to, endeavor to introduce people to God and
Right.
and be, all of this. And when they
Supposed to
walk
be happy.
yeah, when they walk in the door, it's like, oh man, God, I hate you people. What do you just go home? Leave me alone.
Yeah.
And it's like that's not the most evangelical attitude, And so I had to separate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You don't dislike people. This is not the problem. It's not people that you don't like.
Yeah.
You love people. There's the joke, I love people. It's the individual I can't stand. It's it's the actions that I disapproved of and then therefore thought ill of. And that's subjective. If their actions were yelling at me or blaming me for the government's laws, and I didn't like that day in and day out.
Be tough.
So I assigned it to, I just don't like people. That wasn't true. And Jesus, I think the scribes and Pharisees, I don't think they had any ill will toward Jesus, a person. They just didn't like what he was doing. He's rocking the boat. We have a thing going here. And now here you show up and we're watching and we're seeing the potential of it all going away. And we're not going to let that happen. We've got a good gig going and we're not going to let this carpenter dude ruin it for us. And if it means killing you, then we're doing it because we're not going to change.
I think what Jesus was demonstrating is because of the wisdom that he had for the Father, one of the things that he was demonstrating is whenever we encounter anyone who is distraught, angry, whatever, instead of fleeing to self-preservation and the safety of our own construct, as the word Mike would use and so forth, we need to understand and stop spiritually and help ourselves understand that at that point in time, we don't know what baggage that person is carrying that day, what burden, what load. We don't know what kind of struggle, what kind of trauma, what kind of issue is driving their behavior. And Jesus was able to look through all of that to all of these people as his Father's creation and to love them in spite of the reactions that they were throwing out because of their own circumstances. And I at least have learned sometimes, because 30 years ago, I had a fuse that was about that long. And regardless of what the reason was, I could get real defensive and downright angry really quickly. What I've gradually learned to do is take a deep breath and say, well, no, wait a minute. I don't really know where this person's coming from.
Yeah.
They may have just walked out of a situation where he's learned that his wife is in stage 4 cancer. That'll kind of impact the way you relate to other people, at least in this. So I'm just saying, I think that's what we're charged to do, is rather than react out of self and react out of emotion is to understand that we need to love these people because of the burdens that they're carrying, and try to help lift them rather than assault them back with the same thing.
That's good. So that pause you're talking about, you've learned how to use pause, maybe a long pause. I would say that's probably true with everybody on this call, that our fuses, I think my fuse is longer than it used to be. And I think to the very, speaking to the very thing you're saying is certainly one of those. I've also found myself wrong a lot of times.
I never.
And my thought in all of this was that the people's reaction to Jesus was from a perceived threat that he brought to them. And a lot of times my reaction is a perceived threat. Sorry, my printer just went off. But the problem I have is many times my perception of a threat is completely off base. There is no threat. I'm reacting to the threat. The other thing I struggle with is that I find myself in opposition or coming against somebody simply because of the way they look. They're different than me. And that's what I struggle with, is that, I don't want to call it hatred, but it's that I know this person believes contrary to I do, and that is a threat to what I believe and what I think is right. So my reaction to them is negative. And what Vince was saying, it is so difficult to separate. Even if somebody is in a sinful behavior, it's difficult to separate the sin from the sinner in how I feel about it. And that's what I try to do. Like he was saying, I try to separate that sin. I say, I hate this sin, but I've got to be able to love the sinner despite the sin.
And how do I love this?
That's where I struggle.
Well, that is really, and me too, Jeff, that is so well said. Anybody else have a comment? Anybody else have a comment along those lines? Jeff, that was really good.
I hate the sin, I love the sinner, though. It's been used for a long time. And the people on the receiving end of that are starting to say that's wearing thin, because somehow it ends up becoming hate the sinner. It's an interesting dilemma. But my thing here,
that's the difficulty.
Yeah, because I'm looking here, though, there's a bigger context here. I mean, these are all these almost like esoteric arguments, unless we acknowledge, if you go back a few pages where he heals a centurion's son, or where he goes into the village of Samaria and testifies there and had Samaritans and does all this stuff it's certainly not confirmation bias in terms of how they see the world, because they have a very distinct attitude to what the Messiah is supposed to do. And this is very frightening. If Jesus is the Messiah, we're not going to, these violent things that we want to our enemies, Rome and all these other people, are going to have to be thrown off the table. That exposes us to either, it exposes us to a lot of dangerous things. So we can't let that go. I mean, it wasn't just, I'll take Jesus, I won't take Jesus, I like him, I don't like him. No, if he's your Messiah and you acknowledge him as Messiah, all of a sudden you're exposing yourself to harm. You're living a life of nonviolence, and that doesn't work very well in this world.
So let me try to not reframe, but let me try to understand what you're saying. Is that the crowd had a predisposed idea of what Messiah would be like, and that would be a conqueror that would get rid of the Roman machine and establish, make life happily right.
Yeah, totally follow just war theology. Yeah,
just war theology. Okay, so then Jesus doesn't fit that mold. And what Jesus says is, if you're going to accept me as Messiah, it's a more of a non-violent kind of approach, that there's going to have to be change inside of you. And that's the scary part. Is that what is kind of, is
Well,
that what you're saying?
Yes, and that change is scary for very real reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I may have to learn to live like this.
yeah, I'm reading about the Anabaptists and some of the teachings and stuff, and there's like this group who had all their people in Haiti that were taken hostage.
Yeah.
The people that took them hostage didn't expect a response of like, well, gee, we'll pray for you, but
Yeah.
no, you're not getting a dime. They may get killed.
Yeah.
But the response wasn't send in the SEAL team to rescue them.
Yeah. Any other responses?
I'm having difficulty in my mind trying to figure whether judgment of others is included in what you have up on the screen. Is that a destructive thought, or is that part of when you judge somebody else? Say you judge somebody else and condemn them for that. Is that in light of, in the same context of destructive thoughts towards others?
That's a great question. I think that has a little bit of a bearing on, well, any of you feel free to respond, but Dave Brown, a little bit of what Dave was saying, a lot of what Dave's saying has something to do with judgment. So any other comments, and or Dave, just jump in there and help Tatsi's question.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, for me,
What I thought about as Tatsi was talking, and I actually thought about this earlier too, tying in the father-son relationship again. And we have the Father, and we have the Son, who's Jesus. And those of us who are on the screen here who are fathers and have had children, if we think about relationships with our children and vice versa, there are times when our children, because of our, as parents, because of our leading and our teaching and our insistence in one shape, form, or another that this is the right way to do this, then we step back and our children are allowed to make their mistakes and to learn. But sometimes those children will blame us for what happened, when it's, exactly the lesson we were saying. If you do this, you're going to end up in a mess here. And they do that and they end up in a mess. And who do they blame?
Yeah.
That's kind of what's going on here with the people. Jesus is trying to tell them, well, if you do this, you're going to stay in this mess, because the truth is this way and you're looking at it this way, and that's just not going to work. Jesus says several times that he's not judging, that the judging is left to the Father. So I hear your statement, Tatsi, in particular, and yes, I think we do easily probably lapse into a judgmental road, and it's not good, because once again, I think that's based on what we're sensing or receiving from people through our filter. And again, we don't know what's driving their behavior or their words. We don't completely understand. Doesn't mean that what they're doing is correct or right, but that's really not the issue at that point. It's just the reason. It's kind of like the difference between a reason and an excuse.
And we've talked about that. You can discern something, but when you start changing your heart or mind or whatever, then you kind of go from discernment into judgment. And I think that's where I'm starting to come, is that's where the destructive thoughts come in the sense of what we judge as being the right behavior or whatever for that particular point. We have to leave that up to God, or in this case where Jesus is actually, when somebody was saying about how he would go off on the Pharisees. Well, I think we can justify him doing that in the sense of he indeed is also God. So anyway,
But that was my thought, Tatsi, is that Christ made a judgment because he knew their heart. We cannot make that same judgment because we can never know somebody's heart. We have to make an assumption that somebody did something because we don't know the because. And so we can't make an accurate judgment on that. So we can't get angry with somebody or have ill will or ill thoughts about somebody because we have assigned an inaccurate intention on whatever action that was. So for Christ to be able to judge that, he can do that because he knew the heart. We can never know the heart. We can make assumptions, but many, many times our assumptions are wrong. And therefore our judgment of the whole situation is wrong. So I am constantly being reminded by my wife as I drive down the road and I get all angry with somebody in front of me. And she's like, you have no idea what's going on inside that person's car, heart, anything, and Vince alluded to it earlier. We can't know that stuff, so we can't really make an accurate judgment. So most of the time, our judgments and our anger is misplaced, whereas Christ in this situation knows the heart, so his judgment of the situation is correct.
So why do you get angry with that car that's in the left lane and they won't pull over? Why do you get angry with them?
Because they're impeding my desires.
They're in your way, right?
That's right.
And it's my world, my highway, I pay taxes, and the law says you can't ride in the left lane. So jerk, get out of the left lane, right?
Yeah.
It just keeps heating up, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of hating the sin and loving the sinner. So are there some things we're to hate? So we probably should hate evil, right? Evil. All right, let's back up a little bit then, right? So, we had the story in the beginning of this chapter of the woman caught in adultery, right?
Right.
And is there any doubt the woman was breaking or broke Jewish law or, their law? No.
Yeah.
And so they bring the woman to Jesus and they say, okay, Jesus, you judge. We caught the woman in adultery. The law says we should stone her. What do you say? And by the law, he should have said, yep, that's all right. But, he starts writing and then he says, okay, the first one of you without sin, let him throw the stone, and the old guys go first and the young guys. And then at the end, he says to the woman, does no one condemn you? And it's like, wait a minute. And she says, no. And then Jesus says, well, I condemn you. The law says I condemn you. I'm giving you a pass this time. And he says, no, neither do I condemn you. And it's like, wait a minute. But then he makes one little sidebar at the end, but he says, go and sin no more. So he didn't dismiss the idea of sin. But I think when we think this idea, which I do a lot, right? Hate the sin, love the sinner. And then I realized that on a scale of 1 to 10, my hate may be a 7 or 8, and my love may be a 1 or 2, right? Right? And Jesus is saying the opposite. He says, you need to increase the love part and decrease the hate part. So destructive thoughts, I think, Tatsi, they begin with these judgments, and then we let the judgment go from my point of view, and then I'm right, you're wrong, and that side keeps growing, and Jesus is saying, hey, what you people really need is a heart transplant, right? Like you're saying, what's going on the inside as opposed to the outside.
There was
I've,
that.
Carl, go ahead, Carl.
I've been thinking here, and I can't help but think of the lesson that Jesus gave about the log in your own eye and the speck, and the end result is you really need to be focusing on yourself rather than others and seeing their faults. When we can reflect on ourselves and begin to see our own faults, then it changes the way we react to others.
Yeah.
I think Carl, it takes us out of judgment in that case. But if you read that verse closely, it says, first remove the log from your own eye so you can help remove the speck from the other person's eye. So it's not ignore their sin, but realize how much of a sinner you are. Get that taken care of through Christ, and then you can help somebody else with their sin. Not that you ignore the speck in their eye, but you can't really help them out until you're right with Christ.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, right.
Jeff, you've gone from preaching to meddling there, so be careful.
It's interesting too, when we say hate the sin, we have our own sense of what sin to hate. And we have a priority listing, and the number one sin, other ones we ignore, and this is the one we're going to hate, and we assign it to people. And a lot of that has to do with the log in our own eye. Generally, the things we are most uncomfortable with or hate, somewhere in there's a personal involvement with that sin, if you will. I'm not saying you committed it or it was committed on you, but there's something inside of you that says, this is important. I've got to hate this thing. And someone else looks at you like, that's not the key problem. The key problem is this. And, it becomes very subjective.
One of the things the county afforded its employees was counseling. It's got like a medical benefit. And I found myself being really grouchy after a couple of years of serving the public. And I mean, I was a tax collector, that's not even Jesus wouldn't have had dinner with me, I suppose, if, I was in that category. And so you start to get pretty grouchy, and you don't like people, and you dread the day. So what the county made available was to go see a cognitive behavioral therapist. And you can go as often as you like, and they pick up the tab. And they endeavored to teach me that my brain doesn't really know. It knows what I tell it. It doesn't really know the difference between if I tell it a falsehood or if I tell it the truth. It just takes in data. And it's been taking in data of angry people all day, every day for 15 years. And that's what it thinks people are. And then I get into, a confrontational attitude and all of this. So they told me what I should do is I should counter that with good things of my own origin, and do like Dave said. A guy walks up to my desk, and instead of responding to his grousing and his attitude, I would respond to what I'm saying in my mind about him. And here's a good guy, and I remember him from last year. He was pretty friendly, and it may not even be what's going on. It's just what's going on in my brain. And I'm making up a scenario that makes it a more pleasant interaction. And it retrains your brain into thinking positively about people rather than getting into the groove of negativity. And I think that's like, it's the renewed mind, put on the thoughts of Christ, or lead every thought captive to the obedience, or be transformed by the renewing of your mind, all of that. Unless there's a conscious, in my part at least, unless there's a conscious effort to replace what the world's throwing on me with my own purposeful thoughts, I'm going to be judgmental, negative, miserable guy, So the county was good in that regard, and it worked. That was the best part, is it worked.
It's the Chick-fil-A versus McDonald's mentality. You know, you go to
Oh,
Chick-fil-A
yeah.
and the guy goes, "How may I serve you?" And you go into McDonald's and the guy goes, "What do you want?" You know, it's just, it's a difference. You know, if you can kind of get that attitude, I'm here
Yeah,
to serve you. How
Yeah.
can I help you?
yeah.
Rather than, why are you interrupting my day, kind of thing. You know, it's an attitude thing. That you
Those
can
are
start with.
two different kinds of phrases right
Yeah.
there.
I remember I'm thinking that proverb out there that says a soft answer turns away wrath.
Yeah.
And that's a
Right,
good
right.
proverb.
It is.
Well, Bob Powell, to pick on you, we're the wise man. Do you have any comments on today's discussion? Anything you'd like to contribute?
Yeah, I've been thinking all through this, looking back on my own life. And I would say that, you know, several years back, I came to a point where I came to realize and understand the error of presuming to know how God sees the heart of another person. And when I got and worked through that, you all of us can look back on transformative moments in our lives as we grow in our walk with the Lord.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the most helpful things that I discovered was the error, and in some cases the sin of trying to presume that I know how God sees another's heart. So that's just for my own life, and I share that.
Yep. I think thank you very much, Bob. I think the discussion today, we've, as you know, Bob ended it with his comments there. Well said. Dave Brown kind of opened earlier on with, he showed us up front. I can't do it on the screen, but he put his hand up against the screen and said, my fuse used to be this long, about, you know, half an inch or so. And now it's longer. There you go. Yeah. I think for me, I would cast it, and I think for everybody on the call, is just we've learned to use the words not so fast, just slow down.
Right.
Yeah, just slow down. And I tend to think, in relation to what John White said, the idea of hating the sin and loving the sinner, we've kind of just adopted that at various degrees. Now that's in question. That is a binary way of thinking. And that is really, we're still looking at the quote sinner, the person, through the sin. And I don't know how that will ever get us to where we need to be as a reframing to the mind of Christ. John said he finds himself oftentimes a sin as a 7 and a love as a 1. And I think that's been true in my life. I think Jesus, as we've talked about, we're on that road of transformation. And part of that indicator this morning is by the testimony on the call on our group is a longer fuse. Just wait and see. Do not presume. Consider the battles of others. And that has a relaxing way of that I don't have to get in and defend myself. You know, Jesus is a big boy, and God knows, and God will take care of it. And that in itself is a letting go right there. It's 8:00, and we're going to move on. We'll move on to 39 through 41 next week. And boy, this is an action. This is a big chapter. So chapter 8 of John, but we'll keep moving ahead, working our way through it. We've had a good discussion today, just talking about our own motivations and how we treat other people, which is very important to Jesus. So anyway, have a good rest of your week, guys, and we'll look forward to next Wednesday. Bye for now.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.